Okay. Change this over. There we go. Let's make this. Sherlock Holmes. Episode 3. Revenge of the Swapper. Okay, let me change this over to just chatting. Just chatting. Boom, boom, boom. Okay. Ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. I think that should do it. Yep. Okay, let me just exit out of the game now. Hold on. One moment. Boom, boom, ba-dum, bum, ba-da-bum, ba-dum, bum, bum. All right. Now I think we should be good to go. What time is it? Oh, that's good timing. It's just about 8 o'clock. So we'll probably read for about an hour here, see how far we get. Last time on Book Swapper episode 2, we had just got through chapter 3. So we're just about to start chapter 4 now. Or we are going to start chapter 4. Alright, let me see. Let me start making a video of this. For those who are not able to stay for the whole stream, miss part of the story, you can always go to my YouTube channel. I make a video out of this portion of the stream and what we're calling Book Swapper. Each of the Book Swapper episodes are over on the YouTube channel so far. That way, if anybody does miss part of the stream or the whole stream, they can keep up with the story if they want to tune in for the next episode. All right. Let's get reading, shall we? No, not there yet. Yeah, we just finished the last bit of chapter 3. Well, we got through all of chapter 3 in Book Swapper episode 2. That was a bit of a shorter episode, only 30 minutes long. Today we'll have another full Book Swapper episode of an hour. So we'll probably make it through a couple chapters, I would think. And for those that are just tuning in, not aware, we are reading Sherlock Holmes. And we are on the first story, at least the first one that I'm aware of. It's the first one in here. And it's Study in Scarlet. Sherlock Holmes, A Study in Scarlet. And we're on chapter 4. Let me just see here. You can still hear me, right? Yep, you can. Okay. Sometimes when I move the mic around, it stops working. So if you can't hear me, and you should be able to hear me, then just kind of let me know. That way I'm aware if I don't notice it in time. But I think you can hear me now. Okay. Sherlock Holmes, A Study in Scarlet, Chapter 4. Chapter 4. What John Rance Had to Tell. It was 1 o'clock when we left number 3 Lauriston Gardens. Sherlock Holmes led me to the nearest telegraph office, whence he dispatched a long telegram. He then hailed a cab and ordered the driver to take us to the address given us by Lestrade. There is nothing like first-hand evidence, he remarked. As a matter of fact, my mind is entirely made up upon the case. But still, we may as well learn all that is to be learned. You amaze me, Holmes, said I. Surely you are not as sure as you pretend to be of all those particulars which you gave. There's no room for a mistake, he answered. The very first thing which I observed on arriving there was that a cab had made 2 ruts with its wheels close to the curb. Now, up to last night, we have had no rain for a week, so that those wheels which left such a deep impression must have been there during the night. There were the marks of the horse's hoofs, too, the outline of one which was far more clearly cut than that of the other 3, showing that that was a new shoe. Since the cab was there after the rain began, and was not there at any time during the morning, I have Gregson's word for that. It follows that it must have been there during the night, and therefore that it brought those 2 individuals to the house. That seems simple enough, said I. But how about the other man's height? Why, the height of a man, in 9 cases out of 10, can be told from the length of his stride. It is a simple calculation enough, though there is no use my boring you with figures. I had this fellow's stride both on the clay outside and on the dust within. Then I had a way of checking my calculation. When a man writes on a wall, his instinct leads him to write above the level of his own eyes. Now that writing was just over 6 feet from the ground. It was child's play. And his age, I asked. Well, if a man can stride 4.5 feet without the smallest effort, he can't be quite in the sere and yellow. That was the breadth of the puddle on the garden walk, which he had evidently walked across. Patent leather boots had gone round, and square toes had hopped over. There is no mystery about it at all. I am simply applying to ordinary life a few of those precepts of observation and deduction which I advocated in that article. Is there anything else that puzzles you? The fingernails and the trichinopoly, I suggested. The writing on the wall was done with a man's forefinger dipped in blood. My glass allowed me to observe that the plaster was slightly scratched in doing it, which would not have been the case if the man's nail had been trimmed. I gathered up some scattered ash from the floor. It was dark in color and flaky. Such an ash is only made by a trichinopoly. I have made a special study of cigar ashes. In fact, I have written a monograph upon the subject. I flatter myself that I can distinguish at a glance the ash of any known brand, either of cigar or of tobacco. It is just in such details that the skilled detective differs from the Gregson and Lestrade type. And the florid face, I asked. That was a more daring shot, though I have no doubt that I was right. You must not ask me that at the present state of the affair. I passed my hand over my brow. My head is in a whirl, I remarked. The more one thinks of it, the more mysterious it grows. How came these two men, if there were two men, into an empty house? What has become of the cabman who drove them? How could one man compel another to take poison? Where did the blood come from? What was the object of the murderer, since robbery had no part in it? How came the woman's ring there? Above all, why should the second man write up the German word Reich before decamping? I confess that I cannot see any possible way of reconciling all these facts. My companion smiled approvingly. You sum up the difficulties of the situation succinctly and well, he said. There's much that is still obscure, though I have quite made up my mind on the main facts. As to poor Lestrade's discovery, it was simply a blind intended to put the police upon a wrong track by suggesting socialism and secret societies. It was not done by a German. The A, if you notice, was printed somewhat after the German fashion. Now, a real German invariably prints in the Latin character, so that we may safely say that this was not written by one, but by a clumsy imitator who overdid his part. It was simply a ruse to divert inquiry into a wrong channel. I'm not going to tell you much more of the case, Doctor. You know a conjurer gets no credit when once he has explained his trick. And if I show you too much of my method of working, you will come to the conclusion that I am a very ordinary individual after all. I shall never do that, I answered. You have brought detection as near an exact science as it ever will be brought into this world. Or brought in this world. My companion flushed up with pleasure at my words, and the earnest way in which I uttered them. I had already observed that he was as sensitive to flattery on the score of his art as any girl could be of her beauty. I'll tell you one other thing, he said. Patent leathers and square toes came in the same cab, and they walked down the pathway together, as friendly as possible, arm in arm in all probability. When they got inside, they walked up and down the room, or rather, Patent Leathers stood, while Square Toes walked up and down. I could read all that in the dust, and I could read that, as he walked, he grew more and more excited. That is shown by the increased length of his strides. He was talking all the while, and working himself up, no doubt, into a fury. Then the tragedy occurred. I've told you all I know myself now, for the rest is mere surmise and conjecture. We have a good working basis, however, on which to start. We must hurry up, for I want to go to Hall's concert to hear Norman Neruda this afternoon. This conversation had occurred while our cab had been threading its way through a long succession of dingy streets and dreary byways. In the dingiest and dreariest of them, our driver suddenly came to a stand. "That's Audley Court in there," he said, pointing to a narrow slit in the line of dead-colored brick. "You'll find me here when you come back." Audley Court was not an attractive locality. The narrow passage led us into a quadrangle paved with flags and lined by sordid dwellings. We picked our way among groups of dirty children and through lines of discolored linen until we came to number 46, the door of which was decorated with a small slip of brass, on which the name Rance was engraved. On inquiry, we found that the constable was in bed, and we were shown into a little front parlor to wait his coming. He appeared presently, looking a little irritable at being disturbed in his slumbers. "I made my report at the office," he said. Holmes took a half-sovereign from his pocket and played with it pensively. "We thought that we should like to hear it all from your own lips," he said. Just grab a drink. All right, where were we? Let's see. I shall be most happy to tell you anything I can, the constable answered, with his eyes upon the little golden disc. Just let us hear it all in your own way, as it occurred. Rance sat down on the horsehair sofa and knitted his brows, as though determined not to omit anything in his narrative. I'll tell it from the beginning, he said. My time is from 10 at night to 6 in the morning. At 11, there was a fight at the White Hart, but bar that, all was quiet enough on the beat. At 1 o'clock, it began to rain, and I met Harry Mercher, him who has the Holland Grove beat, and we stood together at the corner of Henrietta Street, a-talkin'. Presently, maybe about 2 or a little after, I thought I would take a look around and see all that was right down the Brixton Road, or see that all was right down the Brixton Road. It was precious dirty and lonely. Not a soul did I meet all the way down, though a cab or two went past me. I was a-strolling down, thinking between ourselves how uncommon handy a four of gin hot would be, when suddenly the glint of a light caught my eye in the window of that same house. Now I knew that them 2 houses in Lauriston Gardens was empty on account of him that owns them, who won't have the drains seed to, though the very last tenant what lived in one of them died of typhoid fever. I was knocked all in a heap, therefore, at seeing a light in the window, and I suspected as something was wrong. When I got to the door, you stopped, and then walked back to the garden gate. My companion interrupted. What did you do that for? Rance gave a violent jump and stared at Sherlock Holmes with the utmost amazement upon his features. Why, that's true, sir, he said, though how you come to know it, heaven only knows. You see, when I got up to the door, it was so still and so lonesome that I thought I'd be none the worse for someone with me. I ain't afeared of anything on this side of the grave, but I thought that maybe it was him that died of the typhoid, inspecting the drains what killed him. The thought gave me a kind of turn, and I walked back to the gate to see if I could see Mercher's lantern, but there wasn't no sign of him, nor of anyone else. There was no one in the street? Not a living soul, sir, nor as much as a dog. Then I pulled myself together and went back and pushed the door open. All was quiet inside, so I went into the room where the light was a-burnin'. There was a candle flickering on the mantelpiece, a red wax one, and by its light I saw— Yes, I know all that you saw. You walked around the room several times, and you knelt down by the body, and then you walked through and tried the kitchen door, and then— John Rance sprang to his feet with a frightened face and suspicion in his eyes. Where was you hid to see all that? He cried. It seems to me that you know a deal more than you should. Holmes laughed and threw his card across the table to the constable. Don't go arresting me for the murder, he said. I am one of the hounds and not the wolf. Mr. Gregson or Mr. Lestrade will answer for that. Go on, though. What did you do next? Rance resumed his seat without, however, losing his mystified expression. I went back to the gate and sounded my whistle. That brought Murcher and 2 more to the spot. Was the street empty then? Well, it was, as far as anybody that could be of any good goes. What do you mean? The constable's features broadened into a grin. I've seen many a drunk chap in my time, he said, but never anyone so cryin' drunk as that cove. He was at the gate when I came out, a-leanin' up agin the railings and a-singin' at the pitch o' his lungs about Columbine's new-fangled banner or some such. He couldn't stand, far less help. What sort of a man was he asked Sherlock Holmes. John Rance appeared to be somewhat irritated at this digression. He was an uncommon drunk sort of man, he said. He'd have found hisself, in the station if we hadn't been so took up. His face, his dress, didn't you notice them? Holmes broke in impatiently. I should think I did notice them, seeing that I had to prop him up, me and Murcher between us. He was a long chap with a red face, the lower part muffled round. That will do, cried Holmes. What became of him? We'd enough to do without looking after him, the policeman said, in an aggrieved voice. I'll wager he found his way home all right. How was he dressed? A brown overcoat. Had he a whip in his hand? A whip? No. He must have left it behind, muttered my companion. You didn't happen to see or hear a cab after that? No. There's a half-sovereign for you, my companion said, standing up and taking his hat. I am afraid, Rance, that you will never rise in the force. That head of yours should be for use as well as ornament. You might have gained your sergeant's stripes last night. The man whom you held in your hands is the man who holds the clue of this mystery, and whom we are seeking. There's no use of arguing about it now. I tell you that it is so. Come along, Doctor. We started off for the cab together, leaving our informant incredulous, but obviously uncomfortable. The blundering fool, Holmes said, bitterly, as we drove back to our lodgings. Just to think of his having such an incomparable bit of good luck, and not taking advantage of it. I am rather in the dark still. It is true that the description of this man tallies with your idea of the second party in this mystery. But why should he come back to the house after leaving it? That is not the way of criminals. The ring man, the ring. That was what he came back for. If we have no other way of catching him, we can always bait our line with the ring. I shall have him, Doctor. I'll lay you 2 to 1 that I have him. I must thank you for it all. I might not have gone but for you, and so have missed the finest study I ever came across. A study in scarlet, eh? Why shouldn't we use a little art jargon? There's the scarlet thread of murder running through the colourless skein of life, and our duty is to unravel it, and isolate it, and expose every inch of it. And now for lunch, and then for Norman Neruda. Her attack and her bowing are splendid. What's that little thing of Chopin's she plays so magnificently? Tra-la-la, lira-lira-lay. Leaning back in the cab, this amateur bloodhound carolled away like a lark while I meditated upon the many-sidedness of the human mind. And that's chapter 4. Start chapter 5 in a sec here. Chapter 5. Let's see. Bum bum bum. Do do do. Chapter 5. Our advertisement brings a visitor. Our morning's excursions have been too much for my weak health, and I was tired out in the afternoon. After Holmes's departure for the concert, I lay down upon the sofa and endeavored to get a couple of hours sleep. It was a useless attempt. My mind had been too much excited by all that had occurred, and the strangest fancies and surmises crowded into it. Every time that I closed my eyes, I saw before me the distorted baboon-like countenance of the murdered man. So sinister was the impression which that face had produced upon me that I found it difficult to feel anything but gratitude for him who had removed its owner from the world. If ever human features bespoke vice of the most malignant type, they were certainly those of Enoch J. Drebber of Cleveland. Still, I recognized that justice must be done, and that the depravity of the victim was no condonement in the eyes of the law. The more I thought of it, the more extraordinary did my companion's hypothesis that the man had been poisoned appear. I remembered how he had sniffed his lips, and had no doubt that he had detected something which had given rise to the idea. Then again, if not poison, what had caused the man's death, since there was neither wound nor marks of strangulation? But, on the other hand, whose blood was that which lay so thickly upon the floor? There were no signs of a struggle, nor had the victim any weapon with which he might have wounded an antagonist. As long as all these questions were unsolved, I felt that sleep would be no easy matter, either for Holmes or myself. His quiet, self-confident manner convinced me that he had already formed a theory which explained all the facts, though what it was I could not for an instant conjecture. He was very late in returning, so late that I knew that the concert could not have detained him all the time. Dinner was on the table before he appeared. It was magnificent, he said, as he took his seat. Do you remember what Darwin says about music? He claims that the power of producing and appreciating it exists among the human race long before the power of speech was arrived at. Perhaps that is why we are so subtly influenced by it. There are vague memories in our souls of those misty centuries when the world was in its childhood. That's rather a broad idea, I remarked. One's ideas must be as broad as nature, if they are to interpret nature, he answered. What's the matter? You're not looking quite yourself. This Brixton Road affair has upset you. To tell the truth, it has, I said. I ought to be more case-hardened. After my Afghan experiences, I saw my own comrades hacked to pieces at Maiwand without losing my nerve. I can understand. There is a mystery about this which stimulates the imagination. Where there is no imagination, there is no horror. Have you seen the evening paper? No. It gives a fairly good account of the affair. It does not mention the fact that when the man was raised up, a woman's wedding ring fell upon the floor. It is just as well it does not. Why? Look at this advertisement, he answered. I had one sent to every paper this morning, immediately after the affair. He threw the paper across to me, and I glanced at the place indicated. It was the first announcement in the Found column. In Brixton Road this morning, it ran, a plain gold wedding ring found in the roadway between the White Hart Tavern and Holland Grove. Applied Dr. Watson 221B, Baker Street, between 8 and 9 this evening. Excuse my using your name, he said. If I used my own, some of these dunderheads would recognize it, and want to meddle in the affair. That is all right, I answered. But supposing anyone applies? I have no ring. Oh, yes, you have, said he, handing me one. This will do very well. It is almost a facsimile. And who do you expect will answer this advertisement? Why, the man in the brown coat, our florid friend with the square toes. If he does not come himself, he will send an accomplice. Would he not consider it as too dangerous? Not at all. If my view of the case is correct, and I have every reason to believe that it is, this man would rather risk anything than lose the ring. According to my notion, he dropped it while stooping over Drebber's body, and did not miss it at the time. After leaving the house, he discovered his loss, and hurried back, but found the police already in possession, owing to his own folly in leaving the candle burning. He had to pretend to be drunk in order to allay the suspicion which might have been aroused by his appearance at the gate. Now put yourself in that man's place. On thinking the matter over, it must have occurred to him that it was possible that he had lost the ring in the road after leaving the house. What would he do then? He would eagerly look out for the evening papers, in the hope of seeing it among the articles found. His eye, of course, would light upon this. He would be overjoyed. Why should he fear a trap? There would be no reason in his eyes why the finding of the ring should be connected with the murder. He would come. He will come. You shall see. You shall see him within an hour. And then, I asked. Oh, you can leave me to deal with him then. Have you any arms? I have my old service revolver and a few cartridges. You had better clean it and load it. He will be a desperate man, and though I shall take him unawares, it is as well to be ready for anything. I went to my bedroom and followed his advice. When I returned with the pistol, the table had been cleared, and Holmes was engaged in his favorite occupation of scraping upon his violin. Just grab a drink. Ba-dum. Let's see here. The plot thickens, he said, as I entered. I have just had an answer to my American telegram. My view of the case is the correct one. And that is? I asked eagerly. My fiddle would be the better for new strings, he remarked. Put your pistol in your pocket. When the fellow comes, speak to him in an ordinary way. Leave the rest to me. Don't frighten him by looking at him too hard. It is 8 o'clock now, I said, glancing at my watch. Yes, he will probably be here in a few minutes. Open the door slightly. That will do. Now put the key on the inside. Thank you. This is a queer old book I picked up at a stall yesterday. De Jure Inter Gentes, published in Latin at Liège in the Lowlands in 1642. Charles's head was still firm on his shoulders when this little brown-backed volume was struck off. Who is the printer? Philippe de Croix, whoever he may have been. On the flyleaf, in very faded ink, is written, Ex libris Juliolmi White. I wonder who William White was. Some pragmatical 17th century lawyer, I suppose. His writing has a legal twist about it. Here comes our man, I think. As he spoke, there was a sharp ring at the bell. Sherlock Holmes rose softly and moved his chair in the direction of the door. We heard the servant pass along the hall, and the sharp click of the latch as she opened it. "Does Dr. Watson live here?" asked a clear but rather harsh voice. We could not hear the servant's reply, but the door closed, and someone began to ascend the stairs. The footfall was an uncertain and shuffling one. A look of surprise passed over the face of my companion as he listened to it. It came slowly along the passage, and there was a feeble tap at the door. "Come in," I cried. At my summons, instead of the man of violence whom we expected, a very old and wrinkled woman hobbled into the apartment. She appeared to be dazzled by the sudden blaze of light, and after dropping a curtsy, she stood blinking at us with her bleared eyes and fumbling in her pocket with nervous, shaky fingers. I glanced at my companion, and his face had assumed such a disconsolate expression that it was all I could do to keep my countenance. The old crone drew out an evening paper and pointed at our advertisement. "It's this as has brought me, good gentlemen," she said. Dropping another curtsy. "A gold wedding ring in the Brixton Road. It belongs to my girl, Sally, as was married only this time 12-month, which her husband is steward aboard a Union boat. And what he'd say if he comes home and found her without her ring is more than I can think, he being short enough at the best of times, but more especially when he has the drink. If it please you, she went to the circus last night along with—" "Is that her ring?" I asked. "The Lord be thanked," cried the old woman. "Sally will be a glad woman this night. That's the ring." "And what may your address be?" I inquired, taking up a pencil. 13 Duncan Street, Houndsditch. A weary way from here. "The Brixton Road does not lie between any circus and Houndsditch," said Sherlock Holmes sharply. The old woman faced round and looked keenly at him from her little red-rimmed eyes. "The gentleman asked me for my address," she said. "Sally lives in lodgings at 3 Mayfield Place, Peckham." "And your name is?" "My name is Sawyer. Hers is Dennis, which Tom Dennis married her, and a smart, clean lad too, as long as he's at sea, and no steward in the company more thought of. But when on shore, what with the women and what with liquor shops—" "Here is your ring, Mrs. Sawyer," I interrupted, in obedience to a sign from my companion. "It clearly belongs to your daughter, and I am glad to be able to restore it to the rightful owner." With many mumbled blessings and protestations of gratitude, the old crone packed it away in her pocket and shuffled off down the stairs. Sherlock Holmes sprang to his feet the moment that she was gone and rushed into his room. He returned in a few seconds, enveloped in an ulster and a cravat. "I'll follow her," he said hurriedly. "She must be an accomplice and will lead me to him. Wait up for me." The hall door had hardly slammed behind our visitor before Holmes had descended the stair. Looking through the window, I could see her walking feebly along the other side, while her pursuer dogged her some little distance behind. Either his whole theory is incorrect, I thought to myself, or else he will be led now to the heart of the mystery. There was no need for him to ask me to wait up for him, for I felt that sleep was impossible, until I heard the result of his adventure. It was close upon 9 when he set out. I had no idea how long he might be, but I sat stolidly puffing out my pipe and skipping over the pages of Henry Murger's Vie de Bohème. 10 o'clock passed, and I heard the footsteps of the maid as she pattered off to bed. 11, and the more stately tread of the landlady past my door, bound for the same destination. It was close upon 12 before I heard the sharp sound of his latchkey. The instant he entered, I saw by his face that he had not been successful. Amusement and chagrin seemed to be struggling for the mastery until the former suddenly carried the day, and he burst into a hearty laugh. "I wouldn't have the Scotland Yarders know it for the world," he cried, dropping into his chair. "I have chaffed them so much that they would never have let me hear the end of it. I can afford to laugh, because I know that I will be even with them in the long run." "What is it, then?" I asked. "Oh, I don't mind telling a story against myself. That creature had gone a little way when she began to limp and show every sign of being footsore. Presently, she came to a halt and hailed a four-wheeler which was passing. I managed to be close to her so as to hear the address, but I need not have been so anxious, for she sang it out loud enough to be heard at the other side of the street. 'Drive to 13 Duncan Street, Houndsditch,' she cried. This begins to look genuine, I thought, and having seen her safely inside, I perched myself behind. That's an art which every detective should be an expert at. Well, away we rattled, and never drew rein until we reached the street in question. I hopped off before we came to the door, and strolled down the street in an easy, lounging way. I saw the cab pull up. The driver jumped down, and I saw him open the door and stand expectantly. Nothing came out, though. When I reached him, he was groping about frantically in the empty cab, and giving vent to the finest assorted collection of oaths that I ever listened to. There was no sign or trace of his passenger, and I fear it will be some time before he gets his fare. On inquiring at number 13, we found that the house belonged to a respectable paper-hanger named Keswick, and that no one of the name either of Sawyer or Dennis had ever been there, or had ever been heard of there. "You don't mean to say," I cried in amazement, that tottering, feeble old woman was able to get out of the cab while it was in motion without either you or the driver seeing her? "Old woman be damned," said Sherlock Holmes sharply. "We were the old women to be taken in, or to be so taken in. It must have been a young man, and an active one too, besides being an incomparable actor." The get-up was inimitable. He saw that he was followed, no doubt, and used this means of giving me the slip. It shows that the man we are after is not as lonely as I imagined he was, but has friends who are ready to risk something for him. Now, doctor, you are looking done up. Take my advice and turn in. I was certainly feeling very weary, so I obeyed his injunction. I left Holmes seated in front of the smoldering fire, and long into the watches of the night I heard the low, melancholy wailings of his violin, and knew that he was still pondering over the strange problem which he had set himself to unravel. All right, that was the end of Chapter 5. Let's see here. We might be able to get through Chapter 6 in time. I think we got around 20 more minutes or so. See how far we can get into Chapter 6. Chapter 6. Tobias Gregson shows what he can do. The papers next day were full of the Brixton mystery, as they termed it. Each had a long account of the affair, and some had leaders upon it in addition. There was some information in them which was new to me. I still retain in my scrapbook numerous clippings and extracts bearing upon the case. Here is a condensation of a few of them. The Daily Telegraph remarked that in the history of crime there had seldom been a tragedy which presented stranger features. The German name of the victim, the absence of all other motive, and the sinister inscription on the wall all pointed to its perpetration by political refugees and revolutionists. The socialists had many branches in America, and the deceased had, no doubt, infringed their unwritten laws, and had been tracked down by them. After alluding airily to the Vemgericht, Aqua Tofana, Carbonari, and the Marchioness de Brinvilliers, the Darwinian theory, the principles of Malthus, and the Ratcliffe highway murders, the article concluded by admonishing the government and advocating a closer watch over foreigners in England. The Standard commented upon the fact that the lawless outrages of the sort usually occurred under a liberal administration. They arose from the unsettling of the minds of the masses and the consequent weakening of all authority. The deceased was an American gentleman who had been residing for some weeks in the metropolis. He had stayed at the boarding house of Madame Charpentier and Torquay Terrace, Camberwell. He was accompanied in his travels by his private secretary, Mr. Joseph Stangerson. The two bade adieu to their landlady upon Tuesday the 4th inst., and departed to Euston Station with the avowed intention of catching the Liverpool express. They were afterwards seen together upon the platform. Nothing more is known of them until Mr. Drebber's body was, as recorded, discovered in an empty house in the Brixton Road, many miles from Euston. How he came there, or how he met his fate, are questions which are still involved in mystery. Nothing is known of the whereabouts of Stangerson. We are glad to learn that Mr. Lestrade and Mr. Gregson of Scotland Yard are both engaged upon the case, and it is confidently anticipated that these well-known officers will speedily throw light upon the matter. The Daily News observed that there was no doubt as to the crime being a political one. The despotism and hatred of liberalism, which animated the continental governments, had had the effect of driving to our shores a number of men who might have made excellent citizens were they not sourced by the recollection of all that they had undergone. Among these men was a stringent code of honor, any infringement of which was punished by death. Every effort should be made to find the secretary, Stangerson, and to ascertain some particulars of the habits of the deceased. A great step had been gained by the discovery of the address of the house at which he had boarded, a result which was entirely due to the acuteness and energy of Mr. Gregson of Scotland Yard. Sherlock Holmes and I read these notices over together at breakfast, and they appeared to afford him considerable amusement. I told you that whatever happened, Lestrade and Gregson would be sure to score. That depends on how it turns out. Oh, bless you, it doesn't matter in the least. If the man is caught, it will be on account of their exertions. If he escapes, it will be in spite of their exertions. It's heads I win, and tails you lose. Whatever they do, they will have followers. Un sot trouve toujours un plus sot que les admire. What on earth is this? I cried, for at this moment there came the pattering of many steps in the hall, on the stairs, accompanied by audible expressions of disgust upon the part of our landlady. It's the Baker Street Division of the Detective Police Force, said my companion gravely. And as he spoke, there rushed into the room half a dozen of the dirtiest and most ragged street Arabs that ever I clapped eyes on. "Attention!" cried Holmes, in a sharp tone, and the 6 dirty little scoundrels stood in a line like so many disreputable statuettes. "In future, you shall send up Wiggins alone to report, and the rest of you must wait in the street." "Have you found it, Wiggins?" "No, sir, we hain't," said one of the youths. "I hardly expected you would. You must keep on until you do. Here are your wages." He handed each of them a shilling. "Now, off you go and come back with a better report next time." He waved his hand, and they scampered away downstairs like so many rats, and we heard their shrill voices next moment in the street. "There's more work to be got out of one of those little beggars than out of a dozen of the force," Holmes remarked. The mere sight of an official-looking person seals men's lips. These youngsters, however, go everywhere and hear everything. They are as sharp as needles, too. All they want is organization. "Is it on this Brixton case that you are employing them?" I asked. "Yes, there is a point which I wish to ascertain. It is merely a matter of time. Hello, we are going to hear some news now with a vengeance. Here is Gregson coming down the road, with beatitude written upon every feature of his face. Bound for us, I know. Yes, he is stopping. There he is." There was a violent peal at the bell, and in a few seconds the fair-haired detective came up the stairs, 3 steps at a time, and burst into our sitting room. "My dear fellow," he cried, wringing Holmes's unresponsive hand, "congratulate me. I have made the whole thing as clear as day." A shade of anxiety seemed to me to cross my companion's expressive face. "Do you mean that you are on the right track?" he asked. "The right track? Why, sir, we have the man under lock and key." "And his name is?" "Arthur Charpentier, sub-lieutenant in Her Majesty's Navy," cried Gregson, pompously rubbing his fat hands and inflating his chest. Sherlock Holmes gave a sigh of relief and relaxed into a smile. "Take a seat and try one of these cigars," he said. "We are anxious to know how you managed it. Will you have some whiskey and water?" "I don't mind if I do," the detective answered. "The tremendous exertions which I have gone through during the last day or two have worn me out. Not so much bodily exertion, you understand, as the strain upon the mind. You will appreciate that, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, for we are both brain workers." "You do me too much honor," said Holmes gravely. "Let us hear how you arrived at this most gratifying result." The detective seated himself in the armchair and puffed complacently at his cigar. Then suddenly he slapped his thigh in a paroxysm of amusement. "The fun of it is," he cried, that fool Lestrade, who thinks himself so smart, has gone off upon the wrong track altogether. He is after the secretary Stangerson, who had no more to do with the crime than the babe unborn. I have no doubt that he has caught him by this time." The idea tickled Gregson so much that he laughed until he choked. "And how did you get your clue?" "I'll tell you all about it. Of course, Dr. Watson, this is strictly between ourselves. The first difficulty which we had to contend with was the finding of this American's antecedents. Some people would have waited until their advertisements were answered, or until parties came forward and volunteered information. This is not Tobias Gregson's way of going to work. You remember the hat beside the dead man? Yes, said Holmes. By John Underwood and Sons, 129, Camberwell Road. Gregson looked quite crestfallen. I had no idea that you had noticed that, he said. Have you been there? No. Ha, cried Gregson in a relieved voice. You should never neglect a chance, however small it may seem. To a great mind, nothing is little, remarked Holmes sententiously. Well, I went to Underwood and asked him if he had sold a hat of that size and description. He looked over his books and came on it at once. He had sent that hat to a Mr. Drebber residing at Charpentier's boarding establishment, Torquay Terrace. Thus I got at his address. Smart, very smart, murmured Sherlock Holmes. I next called upon Madame Charpentier, continued the detective. I found her very pale and distressed. Her daughter was in the room, too. An uncommonly fine girl she is, too. She was looking red about the eyes, and her lips trembled as I spoke to her. That didn't escape my notice. I began to smell a rat. You know the feeling, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, when you come upon the right scent, a kind of thrill in your nerves. Have you heard of the mysterious death of your late boarder, Mr. Enoch J. Drebber of Cleveland? I asked. The mother nodded. She didn't seem able to get out a word. The daughter burst into tears. I felt more than ever that these people knew something of the matter. At what o'clock did Mr. Drebber leave your house for the train? I asked. At 8 o'clock, she said, gulping in her throat to keep down her agitation. His secretary, Mr. Stangerson, said that there were 2 trains, one at 9:15 and one at 11. He was to catch the first. And was that the last which you saw of him? A terrible change came over the woman's face as I asked the question. Her features turned perfectly livid. It was some seconds before she could get out the single word, yes. And when it did come, it was in a husky, unnatural tone. There was silence for a moment, and then the daughter spoke in a calm, clear voice. No good can ever come of falsehood, mother, she said. Let us be frank with this gentleman. We did see Mr. Drebber again. God forgive you, cried Madame Charpentier, throwing up her hands and sinking back in her chair. You have murdered your brother. Arthur would rather that we spoke the truth, the girl answered firmly. You had best tell me all about it now, I said. Half confidences are worse than none. Besides, you do not know how much we know of it. On your head be it, Alice, cried her mother, and then turning to me, I will tell you all, sir. Do not imagine that my agitation on behalf of my son arises from any fear lest he should have had a hand in this terrible affair. He is utterly innocent of it. My dread is, however, that in your eyes and in the eyes of others he may appear to be compromised. That, however, is surely impossible. His high character, his profession, his antecedents would all forbid it. Your best way is to make a clean breast of the facts, I answered. Depend upon it, if your son is innocent, he will be none the worse. Perhaps. Alice, you had better leave us together, she said, and her daughter withdrew. Now, sir, she continued, I had no intention of telling you all this, but since my poor daughter has disclosed it, I have no alternative. Having once decided to speak, I will tell you all without omitting any particular. It is your wisest course, said I. Mr. Drebber has been with us nearly 3 weeks. He and his secretary, Mr. Stangerson, had been traveling on the continent. I noticed a Copenhagen label upon each of their trunks, showing that had been their last stopping place. Stangerson was a quiet, reserved man, but his employer, I am sorry to say, was far otherwise. He was coarse in his habits and brutish in his ways. The very night of his arrival, he became very much the worse for drink. And indeed, after 12 o'clock in the day, he could hardly ever be said to be sober. His manners towards the maid-servants were disgustingly free and familiar. Worst of all, he speedily assumed the same attitude towards my daughter, Alice, and spoke to her more than once in a way which, fortunately, she is too innocent to understand. On one occasion, he actually seized her in his arms and embraced her in outrage, which caused his own secretary to reproach him for his unmanly conduct. "But why did you stand all this?" I asked. "I suppose that you can get rid of your boarders when you wish." Mrs. Charpentier blushed at my pertinent question. "Would to God that I had given him notice on the very day that he came," she said, "but it was a sore temptation. They were paying £1 a day each, £14 a week, and this is the slack season. I am a widow, and my boy in the Navy has cost me much. I grudged to lose the money. I acted for the best. This last was too much, however, and I gave him notice to leave on the account of it. That was the reason of his going." "Well?" My heart grew light when I saw him drive away. My son is on leave just now, but I did not tell him anything of all this, for his temper is violent, and he is passionately fond of his sister. When I closed the door behind them, a load seemed to be lifted from my mind. Alas, in less than an hour, there was a ring at the bell, and I learned that Mr. Drebber had returned. He was much excited, and evidently the worse for drink. He forced his way into the room where I was sitting with my daughter, and made some incoherent remark about having missed his train. He then turned to Alice, and before my very face proposed to her that she should fly with him. "You are of age," he said, "and there is no law to stop you. I have money enough and to spare. Never mind the old girl here, but come along with me now, straight away. You shall live like a princess." Poor Alice was so frightened that she shrunk away from him, but he caught her by the wrist and endeavored to draw her towards the door. I screamed, and at that moment my son Arthur came into the room. What happened then I do not know. I heard oaths and confused sounds of a scuffle. I was too terrified to raise my head. When I did look up, I saw Arthur standing in the doorway, laughing, with a stick in his hand. "I don't think that fine fellow will trouble us again," he said. "I will just go after him and see what he does with himself." With those words, he took his hat and started off down the street. The next morning, we heard of Mr. Drebber's mysterious death. This statement came from Mrs. Charpentier's lips, with many gasps and pauses. At times, she spoke so low that I could hardly catch the words. I made shorthand notes of all that she said, however, so that there should be no possibility of a mistake. "It's quite exciting," said Sherlock Holmes, with a yawn. "What happened next?" When Mrs. Charpentier paused, the detective continued, I saw that the whole case hung upon one point. Fixing her with my eye in a way which I always found effective with women, I asked her at what hour her son returned. "I do not know," she answered. "Not know? No, he has a latch key, and he let himself in." "After you went to bed?" "Yes." "When did you go to bed?" "About 11. "So your son was gone at least 2 hours?" "Yes." "Possibly 4 or 5? Yes. What was he doing during that time? I do not know, she answered, turning white to her very lips. Of course. After that, there was nothing more to be done. I found out where Lieutenant Charpentier was, took 2 officers with me, and arrested him. When I touched him on the shoulder and warned him to come quietly with us, he answered us as bold as brass. I suppose you are arresting me for being concerned in the death of that scoundrel Drebber, he said. We had said nothing to him about it, so that his alluding to it had a most suspicious aspect. Very, said Holmes. He still carried the heavy stick which the mother described him as having with him when he followed Drebber. It was a stout oak cudgel. What is your theory, then? Well, my theory is that he followed Drebber as far as the Brixton Road. When there, a fresh altercation arose between them, in the course of which Drebber received a blow from the stick, and the pit of the stomach, perhaps, which killed him without leaving any mark. The night was so wet that no one was about, so Charpentier dragged the body of his victim into the empty house. As to the candle, and the blood, and the writing on the wall, and the ring, they may all be so many tricks to throw the police onto the wrong scent. Well done, said Holmes in an encouraging voice. Really, Gregson, you are getting along. We shall make something of you yet. I flatter myself that I have managed it rather neatly, the detective answered proudly. The young man volunteered a statement in which he said that after following Drebber some time, the latter perceived him and took a cab in order to get away from him. On his way home, he met an old shipmate and took a long walk with him. On being asked where this old shipmate lived, he was unable to give any satisfactory reply. I think the whole case fits together uncommonly well. What amuses me is to think of Lestrade, who had started off upon the wrong scent. I'm afraid he won't make much of it. Why, by Jove, here's the very man himself. It was indeed Lestrade, who had ascended the stairs while we were talking, and who now entered the room. The assurance and jauntiness which generally marked his demeanor and dress were, however, wanting. His face was disturbed and troubled, while his clothes were disarranged and untidy. He had evidently come with the intention of consulting with Sherlock Holmes, for on perceiving his colleague, he appeared to be embarrassed and put out. He stood in the center of the room, fumbling nervously with his hat, and uncertain what to do. This is a most extraordinary case, he said at last. A most incomprehensible affair. Ah, you find it so, Mr. Lestrade, cried Gregson triumphantly. I thought you would come to that conclusion. Have you managed to find the secretary, Mr. Joseph Stangerson? The secretary, Mr. Joseph Stangerson, said Lestrade gravely, was murdered at Halliday's private hotel about 6 o'clock this morning. All right, that is the end of Chapter 6. All right, what time is it? Almost 9:10. All right, let me just stop this here. Stop this video. I'll probably get that on my YouTube channel tomorrow. For anybody that missed part of the story. All right, there we go. Probably get that up tomorrow morning, or not tomorrow morning, but tomorrow at some point. And then, let's see what's tomorrow. Thursday. Might have one more video. We know we got a video for today's episode. We got a video for Friday's episode. Don't know if I'm going to necessarily get that up on Saturday or not. We'll see. There might be one more video of like the books that I find in Classic WoW. Try and get that series. See when I can get that series done by. I'm not even certain of all the books that are out in the world in Azeroth. I found a decent amount of them. So far, I think I have 4 or 5 videos. I think 4 videos now. In that series. But I think that's all we're going to have time for. Not sure if we're going to be raiding anyone tonight. Probably not. We were going to raid last night, but there wasn't really too many people. Yeah, I think we'll probably just end the stream here. Let's see. Probably be streaming again tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll be playing the Undead Priest over on Hardcore WoW Classic. No book swapper episode tomorrow. Tomorrow's Thursday. We do these on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Let's see. Anything else? I think that's pretty much it. So yeah, if you guys are interested in watching tomorrow's stream, I'll be streaming probably sometime in the early afternoon, mid-afternoon. If you enjoyed this stream, appreciate if you consider following, then you'll be able to see when I am streaming. That would help with supporting the channel quite a bit. Otherwise, thanks everybody for watching, and have a good night.